Headcount Experts, episode 4. Chris Mannion, Eric Guidice. We're going to open strong with headcount analytics. Chris, what's your favorite analytic that comes from, or metric, I should say, that comes from the headcount data set? What do you, when you got attracted to working with headcount, what do you look for? Why is it important? How do you use it?
Yeah, I'd say I'm an ops guy. I came to talent from supply chain analytics, so I think the thing I'm really looking for is like, can you predict what's going to happen in the future? And so if you're looking at all the hiring metrics and all the attrition metrics and kind of blending that together and seeing, can you by team predict what's going to happen next month, 3 months from now, 6 months from now? Like if you can do that, I think you're golden, because then you can start making changes. And so I love it when I just see a simple dashboard that tells me what I've got right now, what I should expect in the future, and then what changes I need to make in order to hit target.
I want to get into that dashboard, but to be a little selfish here, my favorite is variance. If something happened and it didn't happen, that story is what happened. That's what I want to tell in an executive meeting. So I have a QBR, right? You look at a dashboard, I'll talk about the QBR, where by entire, every 3 months, let's talk about the climate of recruiting versus the weather of every individual job offer. I'm looking at how did variance happen and why should people care about it? And then to your point, how do we prevent it in the future? So I'm assuming in the Venn diagram of future-looking predictions using headcount data and historical QBRs, there's a big center section of metrics that you and I care about.
Yeah, I mean, you anyone can make a prediction, but the value in the prediction comes in the data, comes in the ability to predict accurately. Variance is going to be one of the key parts of that. If you you and I could sit down here and make a prediction right now on what headcount on Microsoft is going to be 6 months. Like we don't know what it's going to be. We don't have access to that data. We don't know what the planning process was like. So I think context and variance and historic breakdown is going to be key to make that prediction believable and helpful.
Yeah, I'd say like recruiting analytics or people analytics or headcount analytics, they're the same as any other analytics process. It's just what you're focused on. And in the world of how specific can you get, it's about the quality of your data. So for the folks who are listening, obviously you and I provide headcount solutions. So we have softwares that we think take our style and do something either more efficiently or more automated. But a bulk of our listeners are going to be on a spreadsheet product or a siloed tool that has like headcount functionality. And so they can make predictions within a certain, I want to say the word standard deviation, but some PhD is obviously going to correct me. But within a certain standard deviation, you can make a prediction about what's going to happen using the data that you have. So I want to talk about what are people using today, and maybe what's something that from our experience we could advise someone using a spreadsheet today on how they can make it better. But I also want to get into what are the things that you can do to drill down deeper and become more accurate, whether it's an annual planning cycle, a mid-year reforecast, or just trying to, in an executive meeting, tell somebody what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I think I actually literally went through this exercise this morning with a client. They're trying to predict their hiring plan for 2026, and so they're looking ahead and thinking, okay, what is the kind of ultimate goal that they're trying to hit? Like revenue backwards. We've discussed this on the podcast and the kind of different ways of building that. But then, how do you then layer in kind of ramp time to hit quota for the sales reps, and then the ratio of sales reps to post-sales to customer success to marketing to get the qualified leads at the top? How do you then look at time to hire and kind of blend all that together so you don't just have a snapshot of, okay, this is how many people I need to hit this goal, but what are all the metrics that you can kind of bake in to understand what that looks like? And so if you're starting off with just a spreadsheet, you kind of need to make those assumptions, but not just I need this many people by this date in order to hit this number. What is the kind of the ramp time? What is the expectation of the months 1 through 6? Then what is the time to hire? Then what is the productive time based on those two factors? Then we haven't even gone into attrition. Yeah, like what is the attrition going to look like? And then how much of that are you going to have to backfill? And so like very quickly, you can see this kind of head sheet becomes quite, because you're trying to anticipate the future, you're baking in a plan, but there are so many unknowns with attrition, with market dynamics, with the ability to scale, the ability to actually hit those numbers. You're actually not going to know. And this is where I think your point on variance and actually looking backwards to say, well, what did we plan to do last year? And what actually impacted us? What was our attrition like? Was that voluntary? Was it involuntary? is this something that's going to play out again in 2026, or is this kind of a one-time thing where we had to do a big reduction in force or kind of restructure based on a new strategic direction for the organization? So I think these are the kind of things that you're starting to bake in. Uh, and so when you're building out your spreadsheet, you have your forecast, but I think the most important tab that you have is the assumptions. And those assumptions have to be grounded in some kind of reality, hopefully a reality that you've seen in the past, maybe what you did last year.
Agreed. I think what you said to summarize like super quickly is you start with the North Star metric. In your customer's case, it was revenue, but for some scale ups, it might be growth. For consumer apps, it might be users. And so you start with this North Star metric and you say, this is what I want to achieve. Then you work backwards with work ratios to say, how many people does it take to achieve that, production, revenue, customer acquisition, et cetera. And then you look at the metrics, the headcount analytics it takes to get that person from being a line on a spreadsheet to a butt in a seat. And then you layer in the attrition data that helps you kind of plan for additional headcount that might come through as a function of the natural evolution of your business. And so like that North Star metric to work ratio to time to fill to attrition planning is kind of like, that's the start, right? Layering in the layering in the historical data, which is what happened last year, is the easiest, in my opinion. If you're on a spreadsheet and you say like, what happened last year and what was the reason that happened? And so if you had a hiring burst or you missed your hiring goals, being able to say the context of missing my hiring goals is we were still ramping recruiters that they're all now in seat. I do have the capacity versus the demand that you're asking. That's different, even though you have the same team on paper. And so the historic data, the historic headcount analytics that I look at is what happened last year and what did we hire versus what did we say we were going to hire. I also look at the plan change rate, or the things that we thought were going to happen, and then how many things have changed from that initial plan. And then I look at the context. And all of these things you could do with a spreadsheet today. They're going to give you these kind of like broad strokes of what happened before and what do we plan to happen in the future. And if, companies can operate off of those models without any other detail, you and I would be out of business. And so there's some more advanced analytics that I think can go into that. But I think I summarized what you said pretty good. Add in color, obviously, but like, how do you then start to advance the data within those models to get a little bit more predictive? On top of those things, what do you add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that then you're either making kind of wide assumptions and assigning those assumptions across broad teams, or if your team size is low enough, you can actually go line by line to understand, at each individual level. Are you looking at kind of performance metrics of that person? Did they hit their quota for the previous year? Did they kind of perform at the expectation that you had? And if not, why? And then has something changed in the coming year? And so you're starting to kind of take those kind of like second order trends then and bake those into the plan moving forward. So you gave a great point of, did we miss our hiring goals last year? If so, why was that? Oh, it was because we were ramping recruiters. Why did it take so long to ramp recruiters? It was because we were trying to hire when everyone else was hiring recruiters. And so we had to use an agency, and then the agency helps us to build a recruiting team. And so now we have a team in place, but actually the head of the recruiting team is going to come up on 3 years in Q2. And we know that they have a great profile. And so maybe we need to think about, is there a risk to that individual leaving, and what impact is that going to have to the broader team? So you're starting to identify risks to the plan based on the kind of historic data that you have, but actually baking that into the spreadsheet. It's easy to do with software. It's quite hard to do when you're trying to go line by line and putting free text into columns. But you can start to make some assumptions and then start to think out, okay, well, if I model this scenario, what is my kind of base case where, we assume everyone's happy, everyone stays in, maybe we have a similar attrition to last year, forecast by quarter, and then we can kind of make that assumption. Well, what if we then go for a conservative assumption and say, well, what if our attrition spikes because we're going to see all these additional factors in the market? And so like, what does that then look like? And then, well, what if that doesn't happen? What if we hire and actually no one leaves? And so we're hiring above attrition rates, and now we have a team size that's too big. What does that look like? What does the cost structure look like then to the organization? So you can start to kind of bake in all of these kind of assumptions. It's you wind up having multiple different tabs, one for each assumption. Assuming you've built the spreadsheet correctly, everything should flow through. But I think you and I have both seen examples where each of the tabs is a siloed analysis, and so whenever you update one assumption, you actually have to go in and manually update all the cells in each of the tabs, which can take a while. So I think you've got kind of quality control, you've got different scenarios and the base assumptions that are causing those scenarios, and then you've got the kind of second order effects of what you've seen in the previous year and how to understand different trends and different items that are going to potentially impact you in the coming year.
Yeah, I mean, what you brought up is super important. Like, big picture, people want to incorporate something like workforce planning data into a future headcount plan. And both of us have been in the trenches using manual tracking on spreadsheets to make it happen. So it is possible. And I do want to tell those who are doing that, like, what to look for. But a big benefit of using a software to consolidate your headcount data across multiple systems and users is the speed by which you can access it when building a future assumption or a scenario plan during a headcount planning process. And so, I look for things like a simple workforce metric is attrition rate, the average performance rating of folks, average tenure. What does the performance bell curve look like for individual employees as they navigate their tenure? So for people who go for 3-4 years without a promotion have a different attrition rate than people who go 3-4 years with 1 or 2 promotions. So there's workforce data that you can incorporate into a plan to say, how suited is our workforce based on the attrition that we've modeled into this plan, similar to the way I'm looking at the context of recruiting capacity. Did we have the recruiters in seat or were we hiring them, right? So there's additional context that enhances every metric that you're going to use in a model that helps it become more accurate. And so my North Star in terms of future headcount planning is the plan change rate. So for every 100 recs that I thought were going to be hired in the job level, title, salary that they were going to be hired, how many of those came true and how many have changed? And the closer I could get that to a single digit percentage, the more accurate my plans are. And that's what all of this data does. I think it's kind of like a delayed gratification from using a software like one of ours to organize tactical things like making a request or making a change to you're in Q4 and now you need to learn about all the different changes that happened and who made them and why they made them so that you can make a more accurate workforce plan. That's the real, that's the long-term benefit, even though most people are buying our stuff to make requests and approvals better, to make a reforecast go better. But, I know a few of the things that we enhance as far as like, you had it on a spreadsheet and now a software makes it easier. What are the things that are like the metrics people should be doing on a spreadsheet anyway, but that might be enhanced by software? What's your take?
Yeah, I think you touched on a really important one there. It's if you look at the kind of like the variance, what the plan was to what actually happened. I think if you really drill into attrition, the top level you have attrition percentage and 10%, 20% a year, whatever. That's a good kind of baseline to use for assumptions. Say, if we're 1,000-person org, we attrit 20% a year, we're going to have to hire 200 people just to remain at the same headcount. Then if you drill down and say, well, what was voluntary versus involuntary? And so, or regrettable versus non-regrettable, depending on how you want to define it. Then you can start to see, well, did we make good hires? Did we make bad hires? And did we manage and onboard people correctly? And then why did people actually leave? Did they leave and we wanted them to stay? And so if so, what is the cause of that? And is that still kind of playing out? But even then, when you look at the involuntary kind of performance related attrition, you can then start to look at kind of time series of that. This is a little harder to do in spreadsheets because generally you're kind of rolling all the data up into single metrics, which are great to present to a senior audience. But when you actually need to drill into the why behind it, you look at attrition over the course of a year. But what you actually find is that many of those people who were let go, were terminated early, probably were terminated in their first 90 days. And then you can actually trace back to see, well, why was that, and what happened as a result of that? So, let's take this use case. You hire someone to fill a critical role. They don't work out. It takes you 3 months to performance manage them out because you want to give them the chance to kind of ramp and see if they perform. Then you terminate them. Then you start the hiring process again. It takes another 3 months to hire them, another 3 months to ramp. And so you've got this kind of 9-month, 12-month cycle if you take the time to hire for the initial role. And this is kind of a big part of the, why did something not work out the way that we planned it to work out. And what that allows you to then do is like fix the problems then. So you're not just saying, well, let's assume that, 25% of the people that we hire don't work out, but what is actually causing them to not work out? Is it we're making decisions too quickly? Is it we're not gathering enough information as part of the hiring process? Is it just luck of the draw and we made some bad decisions in the past and we can't change that? And I would really push hard against that being the kind of the takeaway there. But when you actually start to really drill into the weeds of these metrics that everyone should know, you can actually really find some action items that you can implement, and then you can meaningfully make changes in the coming year. So you might then take your non-regrettable attrition from 10% down to 5% because you've implemented these kind of 5 steps that you're gonna really focus on in the coming year, and you're gonna track them quarter by quarter. That is something that's quite hard to do in a spreadsheet, but if you can do it and you can actually really get into the weeds and you have someone who is analytical enough to do that, it can really pay dividends. You think about the opportunity cost of not having the right person in the right role, or a role just open and trying to hire. It's not just the recruiting cost, it's the lost revenue, it's the lost productivity and everything else. So I think a bit of a soapbox speech, but I feel quite passionately about that because I've seen it happen so many times when just not really focusing on the root cause can really set a company back and really kind of destroy morale in the leadership team.
Yeah, you just sparked something in my brain about the context of attrition. To a certain degree is tracked voluntary, involuntary, regretted, unregretted in the HRIS. And if you could port that and then do analysis in a spreadsheet to help, implement factors that change attrition, then you're going to improve that metric and then therefore improve the headcount plan accuracy. When a headcount plan is delivered to the business, so January, February, whenever it gets approved, hopefully closer to January, but whenever a headcount plan is given to the business, it's given to everyone on their own spreadsheet, and then managers will make changes to whatever it is that they want to change. I want to take one role, make it 2, or combine 2 roles, or hire this at a different level. All of the changes that they're making are in a spreadsheet, and then they sync with a recruiter or a recruiting leader or HRBP to say, changes I made, and then those people sync those changes back to finance to then get the approval, and that's all happening outside of the system. Now, when I was in a spreadsheet, the reason why I created Headcount 365 is when I was in a spreadsheet, I had this thing called the change column, and I had a data validation of here are the changes that I'm going to categorize any change. It was a hiring manager change, it was a finance change, it was a salary change or not, and just these few data points allowed me to categorize with my plan change rate, the context of those changes. So think of it as my regrettable, non-regrettable, or voluntary, involuntary. It was kind of like, what is the source of this change? And I used to run a process called Feedback Friday, where every Friday, pizza for the team, everyone brings their spreadsheets, we organize them, and I would just write down all of these changes, and then I would have to transfer them workbook to workbook. But just by doing that, I was able to tell a story that was more detailed than just saying we didn't fill a job or we did fill a job and it was the funnel or it was recruiter performance. It was like, actually, no, a change was a reason why we didn't do it. You changed it while I was working on it. I had to reset the pipeline. And now those plus 100 other types of nuanced changes are being tracked in Headcount 365 real time with an activity feed that says, here's a log of all the changes and where they came from, whether it's a person or a system. And then, we talked a little bit about AI off camera. These 100 new data points are then synthesized in I call it responsible AI, but an AI that says like, hey, just here's the story. If I was a recruiting leader, if I was Eric, watching this rec happen, here's how I'd explain it to an executive. And that kind of proprietary idea of how we apply tagging or the quantification of change impact to the storytelling that's why I built the software. It's possible to do it in a spreadsheet. It's just a pain and it takes a lot of time. So balancing the benefit of having this information with the time it takes for you to produce it is the value prop that we are navigating in our sales process. But nonetheless, like that's one thing you can do today. If you are listening to this podcast and thinking, what is one thing I can do today to improve the quality of my forecasting or my headcount reporting? It's adding a column in your spreadsheet and saying, this is the source or reason for change, and really being meticulous about grouping it so that you can report on what the majority of changes are coming from. Anything like that for you?
Yeah, you actually hit on I think two key points that I've seen over and over again. The first is version control, and I think that kind of feedback Friday routine is probably one of the best ways to solve it, because you have to solve it manually, and it's not just in spreadsheets. There are slide decks, there are emails, there's Teams or Slack messages where something in the plan has changed, but it's not recorded anywhere centrally. And so you really have to stay on top of that. Otherwise, you can get 6 weeks down a hiring plan and then realize that actually at the end of week one, something changed. And then you have to reset the whole thing. And then the knock-on effect to that is when you're looking at metrics and the metrics that you're using to make assumptions for what you can achieve in a given year. Let's say you have a recruiter has a record of 4x and each time to hire is 3 months. And so that recruiter can hire 16 people a year if you just multiply 4x by 4 hires per year. But what happens if every month the priority changes, and so you're kind of not you're wasting a month every time you change one of those recs. So one of those recs changes each month. Now you're only closing kind of 3 recs by four times a year. So now you've got 12 recs a year. So all of a sudden you're at a 75% capacity, not because the recruiter's not performing, but because 25% of the things that they're doing are outdated and dismissed as kind of low priority. And so you need these kind of factors to bake in if you're going to plan for 2026, and you're going to assume that if you have 3 months time to hire and 4 recs per recruiter, that each recruiter is going to hire 16 people. And you've got to guarantee that you're not going to change that plan midway through. And if, to your point, the plan's changed every couple of months in 2025, then you have to bake that assumption in. This is why I always like to have kind of a 70 to 80% utilization rate, because you have to account for those kind of factors. Otherwise, you don't have this agile process, and no business is going to lock their hiring plan in and then not make a change for 12 months until they run the plan in the following year.
You brought up a great point. First, there's two things that bad metrics or bad data gets you. So one, as a practitioner, the bad data doesn't allow you to do your job as you wish it could happen, right? So your forecast isn't going to be as accurate. Your weekly report's going to be off. Those are the kind of tangible right nows. Have you ever been in an executive meeting where the metric actually tarnishes your credibility, right? So that's the actual thing that you're preventing with this type of stuff. And when you have so many different people using their own spreadsheets or models and they're not unified in one data set, when the business has moved on to do something different and you're catching up, if you're in a meeting trying to participate in that conversation, very difficult for you to have meaningful input in that conversation. And to your point about time, another thing that you can track if you are meticulous is the different stages of time to fill. So you and I in this podcast and others have talked about the time it takes to fill a job, and also the time it takes for that person to quit their current job and start at your new role as a kind of like a time to fill, time to hire metric. There are two other metrics that we track in the software that I also used to track in spreadsheets that are important to the process, especially as you're trying to lower your plan change rate, which is how long does it take to prepare the job for recruiting, which if you have a inside sales role and you're hiring the 101st person on a base of 100, probably very easy. If it's a net new job title to the business, very different. So the correlation of how many times did a job need to be scoped from the beginning is another point of accuracy that you can create in your workforce plan. If you are going to double the size of your business, well, are you doubling the size of all people we've hired before, or all net new roles? And the last thing is, how long does it take to approve a job, and did that approver get in the way of your time to fill? For example, if you have a 3-month time to fill and someone requests that a role 3 months and 1 week ago, but the approver takes 4 weeks to say yes, that start date the hiring manager originally gave you is no longer going to come true, unless by miracle of your underutilization, hero recruiter just coming to bat. But those two time metrics are also an additional detail that you can add as you overlay this year's performance on next year's plan. And getting that next order of detail about the activity, the time, who's done it, not only improves the metric of, okay, the data is correct, but I, as a recruiting leader, going into a planning meeting, going into a reforecast, going into calibrations, I'm more accurate, I'm more credible, and I'm able to participate in that conversation with the executive team at a level that I think everyone expects, but seldom hits.
Yeah, I think that's It's a hot point that I think is often overlooked, is like how similar are the roles that you're building to ones that you've hired before. Kind of like I take a concept from operations theory and kind of supply chain and manufacturing, where if you think about manufacturing a car, for instance, you could order something that is straight off a production line, and it's a Ford, it's got standard features, and they produce thousands a year. And you just get the next one off the production line. Or you could be rebuilding a classic car from scratch. And that takes a very different kind of set of skills and time in order to do that. But what you've got to think about beyond just the actual time it takes to produce that item is the setup time. To your point, like how much time is going to be needed before recruiting could even start, and then completion time after that process has happened. How much time does it take to test and onboard and kind of everything else? So if you kind of take that and think about the recruiting plan, you kind of have executive recruiting on one end, when each new role is going to be kind of a custom setup. You've got to create that kind of setup time to make sure that you're interviewing for the right role, you have the right people brought in, you have the right kind of process mapped out, and every process is going to be different. You're going to have very custom documents that you want to share with that individual. And maybe depending on the individual, you're actually going to create a custom interview process for each person, because there's kind of certain critical skills that you really need to make sure are in place. On the flip side, you have something like campus recruiting, one of the teams I used to run, where you might have a longer setup time, but once the setup time is complete, you can just execute. We would spend a month or two building out new case interviews, new kind of processes, pre-booking all the rooms, basically getting everything set up so that when we did execute, we had 700 full-time people over the course of a year, because we had everything already built out. And the completion time post the final interview, we aimed to turn around a decision within 24 hours. And the reason was so you can be more competitive. And so you have this spectrum when you're thinking about hiring of like, do you kind of focus on the kind of continuous pipeline of individuals and kind of grow the pipeline that way, and what impact is that going to have? Or are you actually shifting focus and now you're hiring for roles that you've never hired for before, and what is the setup time, and then what does the decision-making time look like? And if you don't invest enough in the setup time, you could get to a point where you get to the end of the interview process and you don't even know if you can make a decision because you haven't gathered enough data. And this is when hiring timelines start to triple or quadruple, and you potentially make poor hires. And kind of going back to the last example of, did we actually make a good hire? And if not, do we then have to kind of rehire this person over the course of the year? And so when you're thinking about plans, you've got to bake in all of those assumptions and really kind of understand the detail of what you've done in the past and how repeatable it is year over year. So a little bit of a tangent, but I really like the kind of operations theory analogy there of like, how do you actually think about the whole process and how can you set it up before you actually execute so you're going to have success there?
Not a tangent. I like hearing you talk about it because I could tell you've done this job before. You've experienced the pain of having to try to explain these things to an executive audience that you can change a result. And that's the whole point of what we're doing here, is trying to share that experience. And what you're shining a light on is that the executive shouldn't be caring about the quality of the data or whether or not the conversation is happening. It's about the nuance. They're participating with their expertise about this data set to participate in the executive conversation, right? So it's not about what attrition is happening, what hires are net new versus not. It's being able to bring that information to a conversation and negotiate with the executives what's possible out of the recruiting team. I love the classic car analogy. If you Google me, I've built the old Datsuns from the 70s. That's like pre-Nissan. They don't even exist anymore. Love building cars. One of the hidden costs of building a car versus a production line, the reason why an individual car is more expensive, but a production line takes jillions of dollars, is because things break. You make them for the first time, but it doesn't always work. There's a calibration. The experience of building cars over and over again means you're more likely to have a failure in a part that you create. And that's what I look at as I think about, like, well, what's the difference between a recruiter, a senior recruiter, principal recruiters? Well, I could give a principal recruiter any job and they're more likely to fill it with the right profile, and they're likely to calibrate. They know how to flag something that might be a discrepancy between what you're asking for in the job and the comp and the leveling framework, right? So the experience of the builder is going to reduce that failure rate. And in the classic car analogy of, okay, we have to build something from scratch, you need to then account for what talent you have on your team and what their build skills are, what their capability is to handle these net new job titles. You're just never going to take someone who's in campus recruiting and get them to do these highly customized executive roles without a learning period. I think the skills are there. It's a normalized trajectory, but recruiter doesn't mean recruiter. And that's the conversation executives having in the room is we're taking the context, the detail of everything that you're asking us for, not just capacity versus demand, but the difficulty of that capacity, the predictability of that capacity. How has the business interacted with us before? What is our talent team's like actual ability to fulfill these jobs? And let me negotiate, like, I'm budgeting an extra month for extra time because I've never hired this role before, but can Chris Mannion, the guy who's done it time and time again, do it in 2 weeks? And like, I'm negotiating, I'm playing with it. And it's really to like create a forecast that an executive could go bring to a board member or to a shareholder and say, this is what we believe will happen. And the forecast has almost an equal impact on stock price or sentiment as the actuals do. So if you sandbag too hard, you're not, you might beat quarter over quarter, but you're not setting the right expectation. And so there's this balance that they're asking you to participate in. And without this data, you're not having it, you're going to let them dictate it for you. And if they dictate it for you and you don't hit it, it is then your fault. It's not a negotiation and understanding of the different levers that happen. And so I think the things you and I are trying to do is we're taking this experience that we have of building workforce plans and we're saying, let's automate the things that we've done so that we can have the results delivered to someone above us or to a talent leader or to an executive or a chief finance officer. Let's take this stuff that we've done. We know this for sure. Automate that so that you can have this more accurate plan. You can have this more normalized investor forecast and you could operate a better business, and you trust me to be making those decisions, right? I said it before, the power of saying no. So but that's my own tangent, but that's when, when I hear you talk about the nuance of the data and what you can extract out of it, I hear you saying it through the lens of like, I've experienced this pain. And you need it. And if you don't, then when you're at this level of granularity, you can almost predict if something's going to work out or not. And it sucks to know something's not going to work out when it was preventable. And so that's what we're trying to do. That's what I know you're trying to do as well, with the headcount products that we're delivering.
Yeah. I think a lot of the things we've spoken about on this podcast so far are like, what are the things that the head of TA needs going into those conversations with their execs? And I think you touched on the kind of really important point there. Ultimately, the exec doesn't care about all of the metrics that you're tracking. They don't care about time to hire, cost per hire. They care about quality, but they're not going to care about the quality of hire metric. They don't necessarily care about candidate NPS. So all these things that are really important to a TA org. What they care about is, can you deliver the goal that I set? And then what would it actually take to deliver? And so I actually think going into those conversations, and I've sat in dozens, if not hundreds of those, I think that the two things that the TA leader needs to know and needs to be able to explain to that executive, one, what can we currently achieve with what we have right now? And so that kind of sets the baseline expectation. If we don't do anything and we go in with the team that we have right now, this is what we can deliver. And then two, like, what would we need in order to achieve the goal that you have for the coming year? And very quickly, you can kind of explain in terms that they understand about kind of capacity and hiring timelines and the ability to deliver as a team. So you're baked in all the time to hire and everything else. But ultimately, you're explaining to the exec, this is our current cost structure and this is what we can deliver for you. If you want this extra thing, this is what it's going to cost the organization. So this is the ROI of increasing the team size. And this is how I would think about doing it. And these are all the factors that I've considered and everything else. So you start with the kind of headline metric, and then you can kind of get into the weeds if they get interested. But quite often that kind of initial, like, I know what I'm talking about. This is where we are. This is where we would need to be. What do you want to do? Can actually shut that conversation down immediately and get to a decision very quickly. I think execs are used to doing this. They actually don't want to get into the weeds with you most of the time. But if you can build that trust and they know and they understand that you've kind of gone through the calculation, you have the spreadsheets, you have the analysis, you have the data supporting it, you have the kind of experience, to your point, that you are making a recommendation and they can kind of take that and use that, then you become that trusted partner because you're talking the same language. You're not kind of just taking tickets from these individuals and then trying to deliver and then 6 months later explaining why you're off track because you weren't able to communicate up front what you actually needed in order to be successful.
One of my favorite ways to I would say my favorite way to interact with an executive is to give them the things they need to hold up their end of the bargain. What I mean by that is hiring managers create recruiting variance too. And there isn't a way outside of again, this is another manual tracking I did in a spreadsheet, which is which manager is creating things that block the hiring process. So now we incorporate it, of course, automatically into Headcount 365, but we have this thing called an encumbrance score. So how many times did a manager encumber the process, and how do I give that back to the executive to say, during this conversation of I can or I cannot produce, here are things that you can do so that your team ensures that we're hitting our goals. So if we are, for better or worse, a cost to the business, I get that we have ROI. Don't clip this part. We have ROI, right? Recruiting produces ROI, but it does cost the business money. And as people ask to do more with less, one of those inputs is, are the hiring managers facilitating a process that allows me to do more with less? Or does my team have to compensate for this gap created by hiring managers not showing up to interviews, not filling out scorecards, making changes to the plan while I'm working on it, long time in stage? There's all these different metrics that allow you to associate quality with a hiring manager. And then you could even, if, the dream of Headcount 365's unified data set is to then tie the candidate post-hire to quality of hire metrics about tenure, performance, longevity, referrals to the business. There's all this stuff that you could do. And then you can associate that with hiring managers and say, here, executive, here's how I believe your hiring managers are doing. And when you have all of these metrics that are just objectively true, someone's going to be the best at them and someone's going to be the worst at them. And if for some reason the person who's the worst at them has the worst hiring outcomes, then this is another credibility adder as a recruiting leader to say, I am able to measure how your hiring managers are performing by metrics of time, change, participation, and engagement. And if you improve these, I will be able to deliver for you better. Here's what I'm doing on my side. And now we have this action plan together that we can deliver. And so I've track it in a spreadsheet, I review it in a QBR, and I built it into Headcount 365 just so that people have this idea of it's a team sport and we're all trying to accomplish the same thing. It's not recruiting verse.
Yeah, I think we got into this last week with how do you actually break down the delta from the kind of perfect hiring process to what you actually achieved, and that's going to effectively drive your ability to deliver your headcount goals. And if you break that down, you start to see in one of the quarters we set our KPI to be hiring manager turnaround time for feedback, and because we identified that we were losing our first choice candidates because feedback was taking up to 7 days. So they would come out of an interview and then we'd have to nudge them 3 or 4 times before they actually put the feedback in the ATS. By which point the best candidates have gotten another offer from someone who could turn it around within 24 hours. So we actually implemented that, and that became a internal facing scorecard that we would then give to the execs. And so by hiring manager, they could see average turnaround time based on interview. And we could then point and say, well, we're holding up our end of the bargain, and recruiting is really, really driving towards this. But these 3 hiring managers are taking an average of 10 days to return their scorecards, and you're losing the best candidates because of that, which means that we have to start extending the hiring process, or you're not getting the best people in the organization. Very quickly, as soon as it became apparent that that metric was being shared, we got buy-in, we got turnaround time sped up, we improved quality of hire, decreased time and cost, all the good stuff. But making those metrics public and actionable, I think they're like a really, really good start. It's hard to do if you're the only one manually tracking in a spreadsheet. So it's great to hear that you've kind of already built that in, but quite often it's hard to kind of pinpoint the exact cause of what's causing the issue. So once you can actually get into the weeds and show that, and then show improvement over time, and hold people accountable, generally just measuring something starts to kind of get people to do the right thing and kind of align. You don't really need to necessarily do anything to change that. But if part of their performance review is going to be based on the team that they build, and they can't build the team because they're not doing the action items that you require as a recruiting leader, then you can really tie it into an incentive plan.
Yeah, two things that I think about when you say that. So one is use of prioritization. So if hiring managers are having a difficulty showing up for things, I'm empathetic to this idea that they have other stuff to do, especially in these crazy scale ups that I used to work at, Uber, Bird Scooters. They were hiring and building so fast that hiring managers had to ruthlessly prioritize. Like sometimes I will make a sacrifice on hiring because I have this other thing that I need to do. So I'm empathetic. So the idea is that we're just trying to empower somebody to make the right decision about prioritization and let somebody else make the call about how important it is. So if you have me, recruiter, siloed to time to fill and I need to fill this job, and a hiring manager, and a hiring manager who's like, oh, I have this business objective to fill that I think's more important, we're fighting each other when we should be collaborating. So that's how I use prioritization. The second thing that's like, I think the biggest takeaway for both of us who are providing solutions in the space is recruiting ops, HR analytics, people analytics only have so much time. And today they're spending that time organizing the data, which sometimes means chasing or unifying or reconciling the data. So they're doing a big part of their job of what should I analyze? And then the other part of let's analyze it and apply it to the business. The whole purpose of getting this data into a software is to say, okay, all of the things that you need plus more, plus what you couldn't track in a spreadsheet or that didn't take a feedback Friday to get in your database, plus more is now you can now parse and say, yeah, how does a hiring manager prioritizing hiring impact quality of hire? What is their participation in time and stage due to our offer accept rate or our top of funnel metrics, our candidate NPS. So you should be pulling from the shelf these metrics that just exist and are correct rather than trying to chase down people's spreadsheets to reconcile, to then log your own change, to then make that analysis happen. I think every people analytics person, well, let's start even further than that. Every executive wants the information. Every business wants to operate more efficiently. Every exec wants to know how they can help. Every people analytics person knows the data that they would take in order to produce the information for those folks. And so now we're just trying to solve this very niche kind of nested problem of like, all right, how do we extract this data from these either siloed sets of systems like HRIS, FP&A, ATS, as well as the spreadsheets from the hiring managers? How do we consolidate all of that into some usable metrics that allow us to then create the story so that the executives can change behavior, so executives and CEOs can deliver a board prediction or a forecast that's representative of their business, right? And that's kind of the going from the top of like, we know what we want to solve, we know the analytics that we want, and it's just the pain point of like extracting this information from the business. That's like kind of built into our mission of just trying to extract that data set and getting a really crisp, accurate, very robust data set for folks to pull from when they're doing their roles.
Yeah, absolutely. You make that data visible, and good things will happen without you having to necessarily drive it forward. As long as the data is believable and it's actionable, tells a story that is important for people. I think you can do the 20% of the work, and then the teams will do the rest of the 80% because that's what their ultimate objective is. You mentioned, recruiting it is an ROI to the business, and it's an ROI because they solve a critical gap that the business has. By making that data more available, you're really helping to drive that kind of performance in the business, and people will come to you then and they'll want to know how they can help, how they can improve. And so it takes a lot of the work away from the recruiting team because they're not the ones who are spearheading the work. I can talk endlessly about examples of people from the business who've come forward and in very senior positions and said, I'm going to take ownership of this. I'm going to drive this forward. These are the metrics we're going to track. This is how we're going to improve. And all of a sudden you have this strategic partner and you don't have to go chasing around individual hiring managers because you have a senior director who cares enough about this that they'll do that chasing for you and have a lot more ability to get things done because they're within the same organization and have control over careers within that team.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is there's history often rhymes. Maybe it doesn't repeat exactly, but it often rhymes. And this information, so I come from Uber and I was super early and I was there through the CEO transition following that's like crazy blog post about, treatment based on protected classes. And one of the things that I took away from that is there's a short-term impact of tracking these analytics over time, right? I have a better information to drive an executive accountable. I can create a more accurate forecast and my plan change rate comes down. And that's good for a lot of short-term reasons. Long-term, over the course of 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, as you start calculating the year-over-year impact of, getting more accurate, there's some real-life examples like that, comp inequity turns over a CEO. I read and I'm going to misquote it on this, but Salesforce had to do a almost 5-year market correction on comp data. And there's a lot of examples of, overhiring and not kind of staying to an accuracy that is predictable that has changed outcomes for companies material. It's cost them way more than the investment in a people analytics person, a software, or a process to make these market changes. Do you have anything from your history of like this massive change, or like a case study of something that happened because this data wasn't tracked?
Well, I mean, hot topic right now is the Amazon reduction in force. I don't have any inside information, but I would love to know, to what extent was this kind of reduction a result of overhiring through the pandemic when things were good? And I know some of the people in workforce planning there are very kind of smart, driven people. And so to what extent was this potentially hubris by leaders across the organization who took the advice from the workforce planning team and then decided to overhire anyway? Without calling out names, I've definitely seen that in organizations I've worked within, where the goal was set pretty high with the expectation that the recruiting team wouldn't be able to achieve that. Then, because of all the things that we've mentioned, all the processes we put in place, we achieve the goal, and all of a sudden that leader realizes they have too many people in the organization and has to do a reduction in force. I've heard this numerous times, even from advisors, where they would say that they and their executive team would always ask for more headcount than they anticipated, because historically they've not received it, and so all of a sudden in one year they receive it, they're in a bind. And so I think this is where the accuracy and believability of the plan comes in place. If you've always underachieved, if you understand why you've underachieved, and then fix it for a coming year, you really have to make everyone understand that it is going to be different this year, and these are the reasons why. And so if you tell me to hire, for example, 400 engineers, but you only need 300, I'm going to deliver 400 engineers, and you're not going to lay 100 people off because you overhired.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we could do a whole episode on the believability of the plan, because there are certain situations about like how a finance team operates and uses OpEx from missed hires to create padding, or managers gaming the system to get what they want, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe we'll cover that in a topic. But for today, this was another incredible Headcount Experts podcast recording. I always love talking analytics with the experts, and it's so exciting to every week come on here and have someone to like chop it up with in a way that's a get it type of person. And next week, I think we'll be joined by Jim Miller. He runs the recruiting process for Ashby. He'll be talking with us about everything headcount and annual planning from his perspective. If you're from Amazon, you want to spill a little tea, and you want to talk about headcount with us, we'd love to have you on. But until then, stay tuned for the next best recording ever of Headcount Experts podcast with Eric and Chris. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.